Venezuela signals the end of U.S. dominance. Let me take you back to July 28, 2024, a date that, on the surface, seemed like just another election in a troubled Latin American nation. Nicolas Maduro, Venezuela's embattled president, claimed victory in a vote that the U.S. State Department immediately dismissed as fraudulent. Within hours, the Biden administration recognized opposition candidate Edmundo Gonzalez as the rightful winner, imposed new sanctions, and began rallying regional allies to isolate Caracas. The media dutifully reported this as another chapter in the long saga of Venezuela's democratic backsliding, a straightforward case of authoritarianism clashing with the forces of liberal democracy. But here's the I've spent the last 3 decades studying the intersection of geopolitics and energy, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that this moment is far more significant than it appears. What's unfolding in Venezuela isn't just about one election, or even one country. It's the latest and perhaps most revealing symptom of a much deeper, the accelerating collapse of American unipolar dominance. And if you think this is just another foreign policy spat, you're missing the bigger picture. Let me explain why. The official what they want you to believe. The story we're being sold is simple. Venezuela, once a prosperous oil-rich nation, has been ruined by 2 decades of socialist mismanagement under Hugo Chavez and his successor, Nicolas Maduro. The economy is in shambles, inflation has hit world record levels, and millions have fled the country. The July election was a sham, the opposition was suppressed, and the U.S. has a moral obligation to support democracy by recognizing the rightful winner, Edmundo Gonzalez, and pressuring Maduro to step down. The numbers seem to back this up. According to the Venezuelan Central Bank, GDP has contracted by over 75% since 2013. Hyperinflation peaked at 1 million percent in 2018. The UN estimates that more than 7.7 million Venezuelans have fled the country since 2015, creating one of the worst refugee crises in the Western Hemisphere. The U.S. has imposed crippling sanctions, including a 2019 oil embargo that cut off Venezuela's primary source of revenue. And now, with Maduro refusing to concede, the Biden administration is framing this as a test of democratic values, one that the U.S. cannot afford to fail. The media has largely echoed this narrative. The New York Times ran a piece calling the election a farce, while the Washington Post editorial board declared that the U.S. must stand firm against Maduro's dictatorship. Even centrist think tanks like the Council on Foreign Relations have framed this as a clear-cut case of authoritarianism versus democracy, with the U.S. as the indispensable defender of the latter. But there's a problem with this narrative. It's not wrong Venezuela is a dictatorship, and Maduro is a thug, but it's dangerously incomplete. Because what's really happening here isn't about democracy at all. It's about power. Raw, unfiltered geopolitical power. And if we don't understand that, we're going to sleepwalk into a crisis that could reshape the global order. The hidden facts behind the headlines. Let's start with the sanctions. The U.S. has imposed some of the most aggressive economic restrictions in modern history on Venezuela, cutting off its oil exports, freezing its foreign assets, and even sanctioning individual officials down to mid-level bureaucrats. The stated goal? To force Maduro from power and restore democracy. But here's what the data sanctions don't work. At least, not in the way the U.S. claims. A 2022 study by the Center for Economic and Policy Research found that U.S. sanctions on Venezuela were responsible for over 40,000 deaths between 2017 and 2018 alone, due to shortages of food and medicine. And yet, Maduro is still in power. In fact, his grip on the country has only tightened. The opposition is fractured, the military remains loyal, and the economy, while devastated, has stabilized at a low but functional level. So if sanctions aren't working, why does the U.S. keep doubling down? Because this isn't really about democracy. It's about oil. Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves in the world, 303 billion barrels, more than Saudi Arabia. For decades, the U.S. treated Venezuela as a de facto client state, with American oil companies like Chevron and ExxonMobil operating freely in the country. But when Chavez nationalized the oil industry in the 2000s, Washington saw it as a direct threat to its energy dominance. The sanctions, the regime change efforts, the covert support for opposition groups, all of it has been about reclaiming control of Venezuela's oil. And now, with global energy markets in flux, that control has become even more critical. The US is no longer the world's top oil producer, it's now a net exporter, but it still relies on global markets to keep prices stable. If Venezuela's oil comes back online under a US-friendly government, it could flood the market, driving down prices and giving Washington leverage over rivals like China and Russia, who are heavily dependent on imports. But here's where it gets interesting. The US isn't the only player in this game. And that's what the mainstream narrative is missing. The X did geopolitical the new great game. To understand what's really happening in Venezuela, you have to way out. Because this isn't just about one country, it's about the future of the global order. For the last 3 decades, the US has operated as the world's sole superpower, enforcing what political scientists call liberal hegemony, a system where American military, economic, and ideological dominance is used to shape the world in its image. But that era is ending. And Venezuela is one of the clearest signs yet. Let's talk about the competitors. First, there's China. Beijing has been quietly extending its influence in Latin America for years, investing billions in infrastructure, energy, and mining projects. In Venezuela, China has loaned over $60 billion since 2007, much of it secured by oil shipments. And while the US has been trying to isolate Maduro, China has been doing the opposite, deepening economic ties, providing financial lifelines, and even helping Venezuela evade US sanctions through a shadow banking system. Then there's Russia. Moscow has been Maduro's most reliable military and diplomatic backer. Russian oil companies like Rosneft have invested heavily in Venezuela's energy sector, and in 2019, Russia sent military advisors and Wagner Group mercenaries to help prop up the regime. When the US recognized Juan Guaido as Venezuela's interim president in 2019, Russia vetoed a UN Security Council resolution supporting him. And just last year, Maduro traveled to Moscow to sign a new $10 billion investment deal, including cooperation on oil, gas, and gold mining. Now, why would Russia and China go to such lengths to support a failing regime? Because they see Venezuela as a critical battleground in the larger struggle against US dominance. If the US succeeds in installing a compliant government in Caracas, it would secure a major energy source, cut off a key ally for Moscow and Beijing, and send a message to other leftist governments in the region like Bolivia, Nicaragua, and Cuba that resistance is futile. But if Maduro survives, it would be a major blow to US influence. It would show that America's ability to shape outcomes in its own backyard is fading. And that's exactly what's happening. Here's though the US is losing this fight. Not because it lacks power, but because it's misusing it. The sanctions, the covert operations, the diplomatic pressure, none of it has worked. And now, with China and Russia digging in, the US is running out of options. Military and strategic, the illusion of a quick fix. Now, let's talk about the military dimension. Because if you've been paying attention to the rhetoric coming out of Washington, you've probably heard the "why not just invade?" It's not as crazy as it sounds. The US has a long history of military intervention in Latin America: Guatemala in 1954, Cuba in 1961, Chile in 1973, Grenada in 1983, EMA in 1989, Haiti in 1994. And in 2019, when Juan Guaido declared himself interim president, the Trump administration seriously considered a military option. National Security Advisor John Bolton even hinted at it in a press conference, holding a notepad with the words 5,000 troops to Colombia written on it. But here's an invasion of Venezuela would be a disaster. First, there's the military balance. Venezuela's armed forces are no match for the US in a conventional war, but they're well equipped with Russian and Chinese weapons, including advanced air defense systems, anti-ship missiles, and even hypersonic missiles. The US could overwhelm them, but not without a massive, prolonged campaign. And let's not Venezuela shares a border with Colombia, a US ally, but also with Brazil, which has made it clear it won't support an invasion. Then there's the human cost. Venezuela is a country of 28 million people, many of them armed and deeply distrustful of the US. An invasion would trigger a guerrilla war that could last years, if not decades. We've seen this movie before in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya, and the results were never pretty. But the biggest problem? The US doesn't have the stomach for it. The American public is war-weary after 2 decades of failed interventions in the Middle East. And with an election looming, the Biden administration knows that another foreign policy quagmire would be political suicide. So what's left? Covert action. The U.S. has been running a shadow war in Venezuela for years, funding opposition groups, supporting cyber attacks, even allegedly backing assassination plots against Maduro. But none of it has worked. And now, with China and Russia increasing their support, the window for regime change is closing. The domestic political why this matters in an election year. Now, let's talk about politics. Because none of this happens in a vacuum. The U.S. isn't just acting out of geopolitical strategy, it's also acting out of domestic political necessity. Here's the Venezuela is a wedge issue in American politics. For the right, it's a symbol of socialist failure, a cautionary tale about what happens when you let leftist governments take power. For the left, it's a case study in U.S. imperialism, a reminder of how American interventionism has destabilized the region for decades. And in an election year, that matters. Florida is a critical swing state, home to over 1.5 million Venezuelan Americans, many of whom fled Maduro's regime. The Biden administration knows that if it's seen as soft on Venezuela, it risks losing their support. That's why you're seeing such aggressive rhetoric from the White House, because in politics, perception often matters more than reality. But here's the foreign policy isn't just about domestic politics. It's about national interests. And right now, the U.S. is letting short-term political calculations dictate a long-term geopolitical strategy. That's a recipe for disaster. Scenario: what comes next? So where does this go from here? Let's game out the possibilities. Scenario 1, the best-case outcome. In this scenario, Maduro agrees to a negotiated transition. The U.S. lifts sanctions, Venezuela holds new elections, and a moderate opposition figure takes power. The country slowly reintegrates into the global economy, oil production ramps up, and the U.S. regains influence in the region. This is the outcome the Biden administration is hoping for. But it's also the least likely. Maduro has no incentive to step down, and the opposition is too divided to force his hand. Even if he did, the new government would inherit a broken country, and the U.S. would still face competition from China and Russia. Scenario 2, the most likely outcome. Maduro survives. The U.S. imposes more sanctions, but they have diminishing returns. China and Russia increase their support, and Venezuela becomes a de facto client state of the anti-Western bloc. The country remains isolated, but stable. The U.S. loses influence in the region, and the global energy market becomes even more fragmented. This is the scenario we're heading toward. It's not a victory for anyone, but it's the path of least resistance. And it's a clear sign that U.S. dominance is fading. Scenario 3, the worst-case outcome. Things escalate. The U.S. imposes a full economic blockade, cutting off all trade with Venezuela. Maduro responds by nationalizing U.S. assets and deepening ties with Russia and China. A proxy conflict erupts, with the U.S. supporting opposition groups and Russia sending more military advisors. The situation spirals into a full-blown crisis, with the risk of direct confrontation between U.S. and Russian forces. This is the nightmare scenario. And while it's not the most likely, it's not impossible. If the U.S. feels its position in the region is slipping, it may be tempted to take drastic action. Grand strategy: the death of liberal hegemony. So what does all this mean for the bigger picture? It means we're witnessing the death of American unipolarity. For decades, the U.S. has operated under the assumption that it could shape the world in its image, spreading democracy, free markets, and human rights through a combination of military power, economic coercion, and soft power. But that strategy has failed. Spectacularly. Look at the evidence. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were disasters. The Arab Spring led to chaos, not democracy. The pivot to Asia has been overshadowed by crises in Europe and the Middle East. And now, even in its own backyard, the U.S. is struggling to maintain influence. The problem isn't that the U.S. lacks power. It's that power is no longer enough. The world is becoming multipolar, with China, Russia, and even regional powers like India and Turkey asserting their own interests. And in this new world, the US can no longer dictate outcomes. It has to negotiate. But here's the US doesn't know how to do that. Because for decades, it hasn't had to. It's been the sole superpower, the indispensable nation, the global policeman. And now, as that role becomes unsustainable, the US is flailing. Venezuela is just the latest example. The US is trying to maintain its dominance through coercion, but it's not working. And the longer it clings to this strategy, the worse the outcome will be. What the US should do instead. So what's the alternative? Here's what I've been arguing for: the US needs to adopt a realist foreign policy, one that accepts the limits of its power and focuses on managing great power competition rather than trying to reshape the world in its image. In the case of Venezuela, that means 3. 1. Diplomacy, not coercion. The US should engage with Maduro, not isolate him. Offer sanctions relief in exchange for democratic reforms, but accept that he's not going anywhere. The goal should be stability, not regime change. 2. Energy realism. The US should recognize that it can't control global oil markets. Instead of trying to exclude Venezuela from the market, it should work with other producers to stabilize prices. That means cooperating with OPEC, not undermining it. 3. Great power management. The US should accept that China and Russia are going to have influence in Latin America. The goal should be to manage that influence, not eliminate it. That means engaging with regional powers like Brazil and Mexico to create a stable balance of power. This isn't about surrendering. It's about recognizing reality. The US is still the most powerful country in the world, but it's not omnipotent. And the sooner it accepts that, the better off we'll all be. Reflective: the end of an era. Let me leave you with: Venezuela isn't just a crisis. It's a symptom. A symptom of a global order in transition, of a superpower struggling to adapt, of a world where the old rules no longer apply. For decades, the US has acted as if it could shape the world in its image. But that era is ending. And the sooner we accept that, the better prepared we'll be for what comes in. This isn't about being pessimistic. It's about being realistic. The US is still the most powerful country in the world, but it's not the only one. And if it wants to maintain its influence, it needs to stop trying to dominate and start trying to lead. That means engaging with rivals, not isolating them. It means accepting that other countries have their own interests, and that those interests don't always align with ours. And it means recognizing that the world is no longer unipolar, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. The question: will the US adapt? Or will it cling to the past, even as the world moves on? The answer to that question will shape the 21st century. And Venezuela is just the beginning. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's defiance isn't just about Maduro's stubbornness or even about oil. It's about the slow-motion collapse of America's military and economic leverage in its own backyard. For decades, the US treated Latin America as its sphere of influence, a region where Washington could impose its will with a mix of sanctions, coups, and occasional invasions. But that playbook is wearing thin, and Venezuela is the clearest example of why. Let me explain why this matters beyond Caracas. The US has long relied on 2 pillars of dominance in the Western: economic coercion and military intimidation. The first is failing because sanctions, once a reliable tool, are now being weaponized against the US itself. When Washington sanctioned Venezuela's oil sector in 2019, it assumed the global market would fall in line. Instead, China and India stepped in, buying Venezuelan crude at a discount and refining it in Asia. By 2023, Venezuela was exporting more oil to China than it had before the sanctions, and the US found itself in the absurd position of having to quietly ease restrictions just to stabilize gas prices at home. That's not dominance, that's desperation. The second pillar, military power, is even more revealing. The US has spent the last century ensuring that no rival could project force in the Americas. The Monroe Doctrine wasn't just a policy, it was a warning. But today, Russia and China are doing exactly that, without firing a shot. Russia's Wagner Group has been active in Venezuela since at least 2019, providing security for Maduro's regime and even training local forces. Meanwhile, China has turned Venezuela into a testing ground for its debt trap diplomacy, with Beijing now holding over $60 billion in Venezuelan loans that Caracas can't repay, ensuring decades of Chinese influence. And here's the neither Moscow nor Beijing had to invade. They just had to offer what the US wouldn't: unconditional support, no strings attached. Here's the uncomfortable: the US military, for all its firepower, is ill-equipped to counter this kind of influence. The Pentagon's focus has been on great power competition in the Indo-Pacific, leaving Latin America as an afterthought. The Southern Command, responsible for the region, has a budget smaller than the New York Police Department's. And while the US was busy fighting wars in the Middle East, China was quietly building ports in AMA, deepening ties with Argentina, and turning Brazil into its largest trading partner in the hemisphere. By the time Washington noticed, it was too late. Now, you might be, but the US still has military bases in Colombia and Honduras. It can still project power. And you'd be right on paper. But military power in the 21st century isn't just about bases and bombers. It's about soft power, economic resilience, and the ability to offer alternatives. And on all three counts, the US is losing. When Maduro expelled US diplomats in 2020, he didn't fear a military strike. He knew the US was too distracted, too divided, and too dependent on global supply chains to risk another intervention. And he was right. Let me put this in historical context. In 1989, the US invaded AMA to remove Manuel Noriega, a dictator who had once been on the CIA's payroll. The operation took 10 days, cost 23 American lives, and resulted in the capture of Noriega. Fast forward to 2024, and the US can't even get Maduro to hold a fair election, let alone remove him. The difference isn't just about Venezuela's military strength, it's about the erosion of US credibility. Every time Washington backs a failed coup or imposes sanctions that hurt ordinary people more than the regime, it undermines its own moral authority. And in a world where China and Russia are happy to fill the vacuum, moral authority is just as important as military might. So what does this mean for the future? It means the US is facing a strategic dilemma in its own hemisphere, one it hasn't had to confront since the Cold War. The old tools of dominance no longer work, but Washington hasn't developed new ones. And while the US is still the most powerful country in the world, power is relative. If China and Russia can outmaneuver Washington in Latin America without firing a shot, what does that say about America's ability to compete in more contested regions like the South China Sea or Eastern Europe? The answer is the US can no longer take its dominance for granted. And if it wants to maintain influence, it needs to start thinking like a great power in a multipolar world, not like an empire clinging to the past. That means accepting that other countries will have their own interests, that sanctions have limits, and that military force is a last resort, not a first option. It means engaging with rivals instead of isolating them, and it means recognizing that the world has changed, and so must America's approach to it. Venezuela isn't just a crisis. It's a wake-up call. And if the US doesn't heed it, the next challenge won't be in Caracas. It'll be in Mexico City, or Buenos Aires, or even closer to home. Because the end of US dominance in Latin America isn't the end of the story, it's just the beginning. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's defiance isn't just about Maduro's stubbornness, it's about the deeper structural shifts happening within Latin America itself. The region is no longer the backyard Washington once treated as its exclusive sphere of influence. It's becoming a testing ground for a new kind of politics, one where the old rules of US dominance are being rewritten in real time. And if we want to understand where this is headed, we need to look beyond the headlines and examine the domestic political dynamics shaping Venezuela's future and, by extension, the future of US influence in the hemisphere. Let's start with the Maduro isn't going anywhere. Not because he's popular, far from it, but because he's built a system that makes his removal nearly impossible without a complete collapse of the state. The Venezuelan military, once the arbiter of power in the country, is now deeply intertwined with the regime's survival. Unlike in the 1990s, when generals could be bought or co-opted, today's Venezuelan armed forces are a hybrid institution. They're not just a military, they're a business empire. The generals control everything from food imports to gold mining, and their loyalty isn't ideological, it's transactional. They know that if Maduro falls, they fall with him. That's why every attempt to peel them away from the regime, whether through sanctions, amnesty offers, or back-channel negotiations, has failed. The US keeps treating them like rational actors who can be swayed by carrots and sticks, but the reality is that they've already made their all-in on Maduro. Then there's the opposition, which has become its own kind of problem. For years, the US and its allies have pinned their hopes on figures like Juan Guaidó, the self-declared interim president who was recognized by over 50 countries in 2019. But Guaidó's moment has passed, and the opposition is now more fragmented than ever. The 2024 election was supposed to be their chance to regain legitimacy, but the regime's manipulation of the process, from banning key candidates to controlling the Electoral Council, made it a farce. The opposition's biggest mistake? Assuming that international recognition alone could force change. They forgot that in Venezuela, power isn't just about who the US or the EU backs, it's about who controls the streets, the courts, and the guns. And right now, Maduro controls all three. Here's the uncomfortable: Venezuela's political crisis isn't just about democracy versus authoritarianism. It's about the failure of an entire economic model. The country's collapse wasn't caused by sanctions alone, though they certainly accelerated it, but by decades of mismanagement, corruption, and over-reliance on oil. The Chavista revolution promised to redistribute wealth, but instead, it created a new elite that looted the state while the rest of the country starved. The result? A country where 7 million people have fled, where hyperinflation once hit 1 million%, and where the average citizen spends more time searching for food than working. Maduro's survival isn't a sign of strength, it's a sign of how low the bar has been set. The regime doesn't need to win elections, it just needs to make sure the opposition can't win them. So what happens next? The most likely scenario is what I call managed decline. Maduro isn't going to reform the economy or restore democracy, but he's also not going to let the country collapse entirely. He'll keep playing the great powers off each other, taking loans from China, oil deals from Iran, and whatever concessions he can extract from the US in exchange for minor concessions, like releasing political prisoners or allowing limited humanitarian aid. The Biden administration has already shown it's willing to negotiate, offering sanctions relief in exchange for vague promises of electoral reform. But this is a trap. Every time the US eases pressure, Maduro pockets the concessions and doubles down on repression. It's the same playbook he's used for a decade. The real wild card isn't Maduro, it's the Venezuelan people. For years, they've been told that change is just around the corner, that the next election or the next protest will be the one that breaks the regime. But after 25 years of Chavismo, that hope is fading. What we're seeing now is a slow-burning disillusionment, one that could lead to one of two outcomes. The first is apathy, a population so exhausted by crisis that they stop caring who's in power, as long as they can survive. The second is radicalization. If the opposition can't deliver change through elections, some may turn to more extreme measures. We've already seen hints of this in the past, with small-scale military uprisings and protests that turned violent. If that trend accelerates, Venezuela could descend into a low-intensity conflict, one that neither the US nor its allies are prepared to handle. Now, let me explain why this matters beyond Venezuela. What's happening in Caracas isn't just a local crisis, it's a microcosm of the broader struggle for influence in Latin America. The US has spent decades treating the region as a monolith, assuming that its economic and military power would always be enough to keep countries in line. But that assumption is crumbling. Look at Mexico, where President Andrés Manuel López Obrador has openly defied US pressure on everything from migration to energy policy. Or Brazil, where Lula has rebuilt ties with China and Russia while keeping Washington at arm's length. Even in Colombia, a traditional US ally, President Gustavo Petro is charting a more independent course, criticizing US drug policy and seeking rapprochement with Venezuela. The message is Latin America is no longer willing to be a passive partner. And if the US doesn't adapt, it risks losing influence not just in Venezuela, but across the region. The question is whether Washington is capable of that adaptation. So far, the signs aren't encouraging. The US foreign policy establishment is still stuck in a Cold War mindset, where every challenge is framed as a binary choice between democracy and authoritarianism. But the world doesn't work that way anymore. In a multipolar system, countries like Venezuela will play the great powers against each other, extracting concessions while giving little in return. The US can either learn to compete in that environment, or it can keep pretending that the old rules still apply and watch its influence erode further. The most dangerous scenario isn't that Maduro wins. It's that the US loses without realizing it. Because if Venezuela proves that Washington can't enforce its will in its own hemisphere, then the next challenge won't be in Latin America. It'll be in the places where the stakes are even higher: Taiwan, Ukraine, the Middle East. And by then, it might be too late to change course. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Latin America, it's about the fundamental architecture of US power in the 21st century. The Venezuelan crisis is a stress test for a system that was built in the aftermath of World War II, when the US accounted for nearly half of global GDP and could dictate terms to allies and adversaries alike. That world is gone. Today, the US share of global GDP has fallen to around 25%, and its military might, while still unmatched in raw firepower, is increasingly constrained by the realities of a multipolar order. The question isn't whether the US can still project power, it's whether it can do so in a way that actually achieves its objectives without triggering blowback that undermines its long-term position. Let me explain why this matters for grand strategy. The US has two broad options here, and neither is particularly appealing to the foreign policy establishment. The first is to double down on coercion, using sanctions, military threats, and diplomatic isolation to force compliance. This is the path we've seen in Venezuela, where the US has imposed over 900 sanctions since 2017, frozen billions in assets, and even recognized an unelected opposition figure as the country's legitimate leader. The problem? It hasn't worked. Maduro is still in power, Venezuela's oil is still flowing, just not to the US, and the country's economy, while battered, has found workarounds through gold sales, cryptocurrency, and trade with China and Russia. The lesson here is that sanctions, when overused, become a blunt instrument that hurts civilians more than elites while pushing targeted nations into the arms of America's rivals. Iran, North Korea, and now Venezuela have all proven that economic warfare can backfire if it doesn't come with a clear off-ramp. The second option is far more engagement. Not the kind of engagement that comes with a laundry list of demands, but the kind that treats sovereign nations as actual partners rather than vassals. This would mean acknowledging that the US can't dictate outcomes in Latin America or anywhere else, and that influence is built through mutual benefit, not ultimatums. It would require a willingness to negotiate with governments Washington doesn't like, whether that's Maduro in Venezuela or Ortega in Nicaragua, without the pretense that regime change is the only acceptable outcome. This isn't about moral relativism, it's about pragmatism. The US has spent decades trying to isolate Cuba, for example, only to watch as the rest of the hemisphere, including US allies like Canada and Mexico, ignored the embargo and deepened ties with Havana. The result? The US has less leverage over Cuba today than it did in 1962, when the embargo began. Here's the uncomfortable: the US foreign policy establishment is structurally incapable of this kind of strategic flexibility. It's not just a matter of ideology, though the bipartisan consensus on American leadership as an unquestioned good certainly doesn't help. It's a problem of incentives. Career diplomats, think tank analysts, and elected officials are rewarded for taking hardline positions, not for admitting that the US might need to compromise. Look at the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, which was one of the few examples of the US actually engaging with an adversary in good faith. The deal worked until the Trump administration tore it up in 2018, not because it was failing, but because it was politically inconvenient. The result? Iran is now closer to a nuclear weapon than it was before, and the US has zero credibility when it claims to want diplomacy. The same dynamic is playing out in Venezuela. The Biden administration has kept Trump's sanctions in place, despite internal reports from the Government Accountability Office showing that they've worsened the humanitarian crisis without achieving their stated goals. The US has even maintained its recognition of Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's interim president, long after it became clear that he had no real support inside the country. This isn't strategy, it's inertia. It's the foreign policy equivalent of a gambler doubling down on a losing hand because admitting defeat would be too embarrassing. So what's the alternative? The US needs a grand strategy that acknowledges three hard realities. First, the era of unipolar dominance is over, and trying to restore it through force will only accelerate American decline. Second, economic coercion is a tool, not a strategy. It works best when paired with diplomacy, not as a substitute for it. And third, the US can no longer afford to treat the global South as a monolith to be lectured or ignored. Countries like Venezuela, Brazil, and India are making their own calculations based on their national interests, not Washington's preferences. The sooner the US accepts that, the sooner it can start competing in a world where influence is measured in partnerships, not puppets. Let me be, this isn't about abandoning US interests or values. It's about recognizing that the old playbook no longer works. The US can still be a leader in Latin America, but it has to earn that leadership, not demand it. That means investing in economic partnerships that benefit both sides, not just extracting resources and lecturing on democracy. It means accepting that countries will have relationships with China and Russia, and competing by offering a better alternative, not by threatening to cut them off. And it means understanding that stability in the hemisphere isn't achieved by toppling governments, but by working with them, even the ones we don't like, to address shared challenges like migration, drug trafficking, and climate change. The Venezuelan crisis is a warning. If the US can't adapt to a world where its dominance is no longer guaranteed, it won't just lose influence in Latin America, it will lose the ability to shape outcomes anywhere. The next decade will test whether Washington is capable of the kind of strategic humility that great powers need when their relative power declines. So far, the signs aren't promising. But history doesn't move in straight lines. The question is whether the US will change course before it's too late, or whether it will keep pretending that the rules of the game haven't changed.